The plane lifts off the tarmac at Perth Airport at 5:40 inches the morning. Inside the cabin sit 160 men in high visibility shirts, most of them still half asleep. Some stare at phones showing photos of children they will not see for the next 3 weeks. It is a Tuesday in October 2023, and the flight is bound for Newman. Newman is a mining town in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, roughly 1,200 kilometers north. Among the passengers is a 4-year-old electrician named Daniel, who has done this trip 87 times. He earns just over $300,000 a year. His wife filed for divorce the previous Friday, and he has not told anyone on the plane. This is the story of the highest paid blue-collar workforce in the developed world. The engineers and electricians and truck drivers who fly into the Australian desert 2 weeks on, 1 week off. They extract the iron ore that built modern China and the lithium that will power the next century. It is also a story about what those wages cost, measured not in dollars but in marriages, in children growing up on FaceTime, in a suicide rate that mining companies do not advertise in their recruitment brochures. By the end of this, you will understand why a job that pays more than most Australian surgeons has become one of the loneliest careers a person can choose, and why the system that created it shows no sign of changing. To understand how Australia ended up flying its workforce out of the desert in chartered jets, you have to go back to a decision made in 1965. A decision made by a man named Lang Hancock. Hancock was a pastoralist who 6 years earlier had been flying his small plane through a thunderstorm over the Pilbara. He was forced to drop altitude to avoid the weather. What he saw beneath him in the rust-red walls of the Turner River Gorge was iron ore, not a deposit, a mountain range of it. The single largest concentration of high-grade hematite ever identified on Earth. The problem was that the Pilbara in 1965 was effectively uninhabited. The nearest functioning port was hundreds of kilometers away. There were no roads, no power, no water, no towns. To mine the ore, the companies that took up Hancock's leases had to build entire civilizations from scratch. They built the towns of Tom Price, Paraburdu, Newman, and Karratha. They built railways, ports at Dampier and Port Hedland, power stations, hospitals, supermarkets, swimming pools. By the early 1970s, more than 15,000 people lived in company-built towns whose entire purpose was iron ore. For 2 decades, this arrangement worked. Families moved to the Pilbara on long contracts. Children went to local schools. Wives, because it was almost always wives in that era, ran the social clubs and the cricket teams. The towns had bakeries and bowling clubs and a strange sun-baked sense of community, but the model was expensive. Maintaining a town meant maintaining everything in a town, from sewage treatment to dentists. As global iron ore prices began their long, volatile dance through the 1980s, the mining companies started doing the math. What it actually cost to keep a family in Paraburdu versus what it cost to fly a single worker in for 2 weeks at a time. The answer changed everything. In 1981, the first true fly-in, fly-out operation in Australia began at the Argyle Diamond Mine in the East Kimberley, run by a consortium that included Rio Tinto. The math was brutal and elegant. A worker on a 2 weeks on, 1 week off roster could be paid a premium wage, flown in and out on a chartered plane, housed in a single donga, fed in a mess hall, and returned to Perth on his off week, without the company having to build a single school or pave a single residential street. By 1990, the model had spread across the Pilbara. By the year 2000, it was the dominant employment structure in Australian resources. By 2014, at the peak of the mining boom, more than 60,000 Australians were flying in and out of remote work sites every week. By 2012, the average fly-in, fly-out worker in the Pilbara was earning more than a partner at a mid-tier Sydney law firm. The wages, on paper, were extraordinary. But by 2013, the bodies were beginning to add up. In November 2014, the Parliament of Western Australia established a committee of inquiry into mental health impacts of fly-in, fly-out work arrangements. The committee was chaired by a Liberal MP named Graham Jacobs, himself a former rural doctor. Over the course of 14 months, the inquiry heard from workers, widows, psychologists, union representatives, and mining executives. The final report, published in June 2015, entitled The impact of FIFO work practices on mental health ran to 370 pages. Its findings were the first serious attempt to quantify what the industry had been quietly suspecting for years. The committee found that FIFO workers experienced rates of psychological distress nearly twice that of the general Australian population. Roster patterns of 4 weeks on and 1 week off, which were standard at many sites, were associated with the highest rates of relationship breakdown. The committee identified at least 9 suicides of FIFO workers in Western Australia between 2009 and 2014. The true figure was almost certainly higher. Suicides that occurred during off-swing weeks at home were not classified as work-related and therefore did not appear in any official statistic. The mining companies, when called to give evidence, pointed to their employee assistance programs and their wellness apps. The widows pointed to phone records showing their husbands had called the company hotline and been placed on hold. A follow-up study published in 2018 by researchers at Edith Cowan University in Perth, led by Professor Philip Della, surveyed over 3,000 resources workers. 33% of FIFO workers reported moderate to severe symptoms of depression. 28% reported moderate to severe anxiety. The rate of relationship dissolution among workers on rosters longer than 2 weeks on was almost double that of workers on shorter rosters. The researchers concluded that the FIFO lifestyle was not merely correlated with poor mental health outcomes, but was structurally producing them through a specific mechanism the report called compressed reintegration. The impossible psychological task of being a full presence in a marriage for 1 week and a ghost for 3. For Daniel, the electrician on the Tuesday morning flight, the mechanism had a name and a face. His wife had described it in their last fight as the door. The moment he walked through the front door of their house in Mandurah after 21 days away, she said he was someone else for the first 48 hours. Quiet, withdrawn, sleeping at strange hours. By day 4, he would start to soften, to laugh at the kids' jokes, to ask about her work. By day 6, they would have something like a marriage again. On day 7, he would pack his bag. This pattern, repeated across tens of thousands of households, is the hidden cost the wage figures never capture. There is also the geography of the off week itself. The mining companies fly workers home to Perth, but Perth has not been the actual home of a FIFO worker for nearly a decade. Western Australian property prices, fueled in large part by the mining wages, pushed workers further and further out, then onto the East Coast entirely. By 2022, roughly 40% of Pilbara FIFO workers were flying not from Perth, but from Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Cairns, and Adelaide, on company-funded connecting flights. A worker's commute could exceed 8 hours each way. The off-week in practice was closer to 5 days. The mining companies were not blind to this. Rio Tinto, BHP, and Fortescue all expanded mental health programs through the late 2010s. BHP introduced a peer support program called Mates in Mining. Fortescue, under the leadership of Andrew Forrest, published a charter committing to mental health screening for all FIFO staff. Forrest himself, in a 2019 interview with the Australian Financial Review, called the mental health crisis in his own industry the thing that keeps me awake at night, and yet the rosters did not meaningfully change. The economic logic of the 4-on, 1-off swing was too strong. A shorter roster meant more flights, more transit time, more overlap shifts, more cost per ton of ore. With iron ore prices touching $200 US dollars a ton in 2021, no company was willing to be the first to absorb the additional expense. In 2021, the Western Australian government introduced the Code of Practice on Mentally Healthy Workplaces for Fly-In, Fly-Out workers. The code recommended shorter swings, better facilities, and mandatory mental health training for supervisors. It was critically a code of practice, not a regulation. Compliance was voluntary. 2 years after its introduction, an audit by WorkSafe WA found that fewer than 1-inch 3 sites had implemented even half of its recommendations. The reckoning, if there has been one, is still arriving in slow motion. In 2022, a coronial inquest in Perth examined the suicides of 9 FIFO workers between 2014 and 2018. The coroner, Rose Fogliani, delivered her findings in a report that was unusual in its directness. She found that the design of the FIFO work model itself, not merely individual mental health failings, was a contributing factor in the deaths. She recommended a mandatory regulatory framework, an end to 4-week swings, and the establishment of an independent mental health authority for the resources sector. Of her recommendations, the Western Australian government in 2023 committed to implementing 3. The mining industry response was supportive in tone and cautious in substance. Meanwhile, the wages keep climbing. As of 2024, a heavy vehicle operator in the Pilbara can earn $180,000 a year without overtime. An electrician like Daniel can clear $300,000. A shutdown supervisor on a major site can push $400,000. The Australian resources sector exported $450 billion worth of commodities in the 2022 to 23 financial year, more than the entire annual GDP of New Zealand. The Pilbara alone produces roughly 40% of the world's seaborne iron ore. Without the FIFO workforce, this output is not possible at anything resembling current cost structures. So the planes keep flying every morning at 5:40 from Perth, every Sunday afternoon from Brisbane, every Tuesday from Adelaide, 160 workers at a time, 21 days on, 7 days off. The highest blue-collar wages in the developed world running through their accounts while their kids grow up in photographs. Daniel landed in Newman that Tuesday morning at 7:30. He worked his swing. He flew home 21 days later to an empty house in Mandurah, his wife and the 2 kids having moved in with her sister in Adelaide. He took 4 days off. He flew back to Newman the following Tuesday. That, more than any single statistic, is the architecture of the Australian resources economy. It is a system that produces extraordinary national wealth by asking a specific subset of Australians to be absent from their own lives for 36 weeks a year, and then pays them enough that walking away feels financially irrational even when staying feels personally impossible. The mining companies did not invent loneliness. They simply built a business model that depended on it and discovered, to no one's particular surprise, that loneliness scaled. The plane lifts off at 5:40 inches the morning from Perth, and 160 men in high visibility shirts stare at their phones. And a 3-4-year-old electrician named Daniel does not yet know that the next time he flies home, there will be no one waiting at the airport. He has done this trip 87 times. He will do it many more. The pattern this story reveals is not unique to mining. It is the same pattern that built Australian sugar, Australian pearling, Australian construction in the offshore oil sector. The country has always paid its remote workers a premium and then quietly externalized the social cost onto their families. What is changing now is that the families are beginning to send the invoice back. There are class actions being prepared in Perth right now, brought by the spouses and adult children of deceased FIFO workers. That may force the industry to internalize a cost it has spent 4 decades pretending was someone else's problem. Whether those cases succeed will determine not just the future of the Pilbara, but whether Australia can afford to keep telling itself that the wages are enough. There is another story here about the woman who first tried to sue Rio Tinto on behalf of her dead husband in 2011. Her name was Janine Whitaker, and her husband Mark had worked the Tom Price iron ore operation for 9 years on a 2-in-1 roster before he was found in his donga on a Tuesday morning in March of 2010, dead at 41 of what the coroner eventually classified as cardiac arrhythmia, though the toxicology showed a blood alcohol reading of 0.19 and 3 different prescription sleep medications stacked on the bedside table. Janine filed in the Western Australian Supreme Court in October 2011, arguing that Rio Tinto had a duty of care that extended beyond the perimeter fence of the camp. That the rostering pattern itself was the proximate cause, that the company knew through its own internal wellness audits commissioned in 2007, 2009, that men on extended swings were drinking themselves into early graves. The case ran for 3.5 years. It was settled in early 2015 for an undisclosed sum with no admission of liability. Janine signed a non-disclosure agreement that she has, to her credit, mostly honored. What she has said in the one interview she gave to the ABC's background briefing in 2018 is that the settlement was less than the cost of a 4-bedroom house in suburban Perth, and that the lawyers took 40% of it, and that she would do it again, but she would do it differently, and she would do it as part of a class. That is what is happening now. The firm of Slater and Gordon working with two smaller Perth practices, has been quietly assembling a register of affected families since 2022. The numbers are unconfirmed, but people close to the filing have suggested the register holds somewhere between 340 and 500 households. Drawn from across BHP, Rio Tinto, Fortescue, and a handful of contractor firms operating in the Pilbara and the goldfields, the legal theory has evolved since Janine's case. It no longer rests on a single duty of care argument. It rests on the cumulative evidence of internal documents showing that the major operators modeled the mental health costs of their rostering decisions as early as 2008 and chose repeatedly the rosters that maximized throughput over the rosters that minimized harm. If any of that documentary record holds up in cross-examination, the industry will be looking at exposure in the billions. The counter-argument, made vigorously by the Minerals Council of Australia and by individual company spokespeople, is that FIFO workers are adults who sign contracts with full disclosure, that the wages compensate for the conditions, that the alternative is the death of the regional economy, and that the families who are now suing knew exactly what they were marrying into. There is a version of that argument which is true. There is also a version which is the same argument the asbestos industry made in 1978 and the tobacco industry made in 1994, and history has not been kind to either.